anything like that. And we'll just skip over the delicious irony that it's three white guys talking.
Yeah.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Thoughts. My name is Alexandros.
And my name is Hamish, and today we are with the wonderful Bjoern Freter, who is an independent researcher at Knoxville, Tennessee.
Here are some thoughts on superiorism.
Bjoern, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It's a real pleasure to have you. So the first thing we want to know is maybe just tell us a bit about yourself. Whereabouts did you come from, and when did you get into philosophy?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Currently, I'm working as an independent scholar in Knoxville, Tennessee, in the US. I'm actually born and trained in philosophy in Germany. I studied in Kiel and in Berlin. I decided actually when I went to school that I want to start studying philosophy because I was always attracted to a couple of the big questions. And very early I was concerned with the problem that philosophy does exclude a lot of people, either be it because they are not intelligent enough, whatever that means, or because certain groups were excluded. But my current topic, or the topic that we want to talk about today, is something that just a couple of years ago I realized it has to be the main research area for me, because I was mostly being blessed by being able to go to a conference in Africa where I realized, by being told firsthand stories of lived experience of colonialism, of the drastic effects that this still has in today's world. And I realized that I involuntarily, as somebody who has inherited this kind of culture, still continues to keep this kind of suppression alive. And that's sort of my waking up experience. And since then, which is probably 5 or 6 years ago, I started to reorient my research on questions of racism and colonialism.
So how does one think critically about these issues? What's the, I don't want to say methodology, but how do we approach these issues?
What I think has to be done in the first place is something that is, especially in the continental European, or in a more broader sense in the analytic tradition, something that has been disregarded a little bit, which is a very personal approach to it. I think without experiencing and without allowing yourself to experience a very personal involvement in these issues, and without understanding that you are personally an agent in the continuation of oppressive traditions, I don't think that you can have an appropriate angle with regards to this topic. It is, from my understanding, not possible to have an objective view on this. This is a matter of people actually suffering, and this is a matter of you actually engaging in the continuation of suffering, if you want it or not. It is one of the foundational problems of these studies that a lot of people say, but I'm not racist, I'm not, as I like to say, I call it, I'm not a superiorist, I'm not a sexist. But you have to understand that if you live within a society that is founded on superiorist, be it sexist, be it racist, be it ageist, or whatever it is, if you live in a society that is systemically founded upon that, and you, even without your doing, are within the privileged group, and you do not fight that privilege, you will continue to stabilize this system, which is, I think, a very important initial thought to have before you start working on it.
So Bjoern, let's just back up a little bit. You have said in some of your work that you think the history of philosophy has been corrupted. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think I might need to rephrase that. I'm not sure if the history of philosophy has been corrupted. I think that would be true, at least with the so-called Eurocentric, or what I like to call Eurocentric or Western philosophy, that has been corrupted, I think, as of the Enlightenment. The question if philosophy in itself is corrupted would be sort of the question if the human being is corrupted in a certain way. I think that's a question that's a little bit too big for me to answer, so I'm going to focus on the smaller issue. What I'm most offended and most irritated by is that in the historical period of the Enlightenment, and that is true for the French, for the British, the North American or the German Enlightenment, is that it was this time period where we developed most of the foundational values that we eulogize until today. For example, freedom or autonomy or democracy. And it was during this time that Europe continued his subjugation of the rest of the world, or not only Europe, but also, of course, North America. And the strangest thing to me is the blatant the obvious tension between, on the one hand, the development of the thoughts of equality, as we can see, for example, in Jeffersonian politics, or as we see it, for example, in Kantian philosophy, on the one hand, and the very obvious injustice that has been done on the other hand. For example, and most importantly, in my research, in the way that the Western world colonially enacted the rest of the world, or a large portion of the rest of the world. I think it's especially apparent when you look to North America, and you see this weird situation of actually a double homicide, a double genocide, that people who were religiously persecuted fled to another continent, committed a genocide on the people they found there, and then to build up their very own country, shipped in the next another amount of people to commit sort of the next genocide, to build that country to what it is today. And one has to ask the question, if it is only possible to become a Western nation, if it is only possible to become a political body that is founded on Western ideas by committing these kinds of atrocious violence, should we have become what we have become? And when I look into the Enlightenment period, I don't find that critically approached. I usually find a large amount of very forced argumentation why this is technically true. And I think usually that has to do with the fact that when Enlightenment philosophers, and I know I'm generalizing here a little bit, but very often when Enlightenment philosophers talk about the human being, there are some implicit, tacit premises that are applied to that concept, which rule out a lot of the human beings we would in the first place think are integrated. So if you look closely into the people who are admitted to the project of enlightenment, for example, within Kantian philosophy, you very quickly realize that the sapere aude is actually something that is presented that should be applicable to all human beings. But when you look closely, you realize that Kant very often does not talk about the human being. He talks about reason and the interests and needs of reason. And that indeed has a deeper meaning, because those who are not able to make good use of their reason in his understanding are excluded. So that means people who do not use their reason in the way Kant thinks you should use your reason are no longer included. And that, for example, extends to women, because women are not in the sense, are not in the required sense able to make use of their reason. And it, of course, it also excludes usually all non-white people, and it excludes all non-heterosexual people.
So Bjoern, you're talking about how Kant was using his concept of reason to delineate between what a human is and what a human isn't. And so I think the question that arises is, would we be able, in a discussion with Kant, would we be able to persuade him that a woman, somebody who does not look like him or does not act like him, was a person, was a human being?
That's indeed a very difficult question. I don't think he would doubt the humanness of that person, but I think it's a human in a lower sense, and it is a human that cannot, that is not, yeah, it would be a human being not being able to self-determine his or her or their character, which is rather an important feature within Kant's philosophy, to become fully human. So I think what these philosophers of the Enlightenment and Kant, that includes Kant, usually do is to have a gradual understanding of what a human being is. So there's no dehumanizing and taking the humanness away from the human beings. But there is a more or less a graduation included in what they understand as a human being. And the ongoing question that I'm unable to answer until today is, why did they do that? Why do human beings at the same time have this weird inclination to not be superiorist or to not be racist or sexist? Because it's very rare that you, until today, find a human being who openly admits, I'm a sexist and I'm at peace with that, or I'm a racist and I'm at peace with that. Usually you find people who deny that they are these things, but at the same time we find racism or sexism everywhere. But it is always, when you look at the specific situation, a misunderstanding, or it was just a joke, or it was an exception to the rule, because you usually don't do that. And then a strange thing, on a sophisticated philosophical level, we find that here already. So as to answer your question, I don't think Kant would deny, if you show him a human being, that that human being is a human being, but he would apply some sort of gradual scale. And that gradual scale usually is the lesser or the fuller human, or I think in a more prominent way in the Enlightenment, it was formulated, especially in Hegel, it is the child or the adult version of a human being.
Could we get some more examples of that? So in some of your papers, you were quoting Hume, Rousseau. So how did other philosophers of the Enlightenment apply this gradual scale to humanness?
And sort of a follow-up question as well would be, does it have to influence their other philosophies of equality and freedom, such as Kant's categorical imperative?
Yes.
Can we not just ignore the racist rants and take the good stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question. So to try to answer that first question, so there's a famous footnote in Hume's On National Characters, which is especially interesting because he added it in later editions, where he points out the inferiority of what he addresses, of the people he addresses as Negroes, which of course I'm only using within the quote here. And he points out that he has never seen any Negro of having any cultural impact or having produced anything of cultural relevance. For example, he says, there are Negro slaves dispersed all over Europe, of which none ever discovered any symptoms of ingenuity, though low people amongst us and distinguish themselves in every profession. In Jamaica, indeed, they talk of one Negro as a man of parts and learning, but it's likely that he is admired only for very slender accomplishments, like a parrot who speaks a few words plainly. I think that is a fairly bold way to show the deeply rooted understanding of people different than the philosopher, or that differ in the understanding of the philosopher compared to his self-understanding. But usually people tend to argue that these texts are outdated, that it was just the way you thought at that particular time. And I think the most important question is indeed, what does that mean for us today? It is irritating, it is strange, but can it not just be thrown away, and can we not just disregard it and focus on the more important points of the philosophy? But the question is, why do we consider some things more important and other things less important? And I think sometimes it has in fact to do with the fact that we consider some things are things that we are more comfortable with, and some things are things that we are less comfortable with. And I think sometimes what we regard as the more important thing is also the thing that we regard as the more convenient or the more comfortable thing, or the thing that we're more comfortable with. But I think the problem is not that we already know that the inherent superiorism that we find amongst philosophers of the Enlightenment does affect us today. I think what the scandal is that we do not know that. And that we do not know that is because there has been too little research on that. So the problem I try to point out is, if somebody, for example, Kant, thinks that women are not able to make use of their own reason in a way that they are able to become adult for humans. Doesn't that also mean that the whole thoughts, feelings, understandings, ways of world building, ways of world making of female human beings are disregarded? And does that not also mean that if all of that is disregarded, he did not take it into account when he was talking about his ideas of human reason? And if he talks about human reason, then we have to understand that he didn't actually talk about human reason, but only the relevant, the significant human reason, which is the human reason in the way sort of he found it in himself. And if women are taken out of this equation, then we do not have in the end a critique of pure reason, but then we have a critique of pure male reason. Is that still an interesting book? It is still an interesting book. It is still a valuable contribution to philosophy. The problem, yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, like, it seems to me that philosophy is constantly being updated. I remember a quote about continental philosophy, that all philosophy since Kant has just been basically replying to Kant, updating Kant, making his system better and improved. And can we not just say, there's lots of current day philosophers that are Kantians, but who will disavow that kind of view. So can we not just update his systems to make it better?
Yes, but the question is, so I'm not sure if I agree to modern philosophy just being updates to Kant, but because nobody can deny the massive influence. There's no doubt about it, and I would not deny that, and I will also not deny his importance for the history of philosophy. The question that I'm asking, which I think is not answered and is not asked widely enough, is if he had these opinions, how can we be sure that these opinions did not influence his philosophy? And I'm not explicitly not saying that they did. I assume they did, but I cannot prove that. But I think we would need to check that. And I think we need to check that because the Western world, as much as it tries to establish, it continues to establish itself as the moral authority of the world, is at the same time the great murderer of the world. There have been, it's literally oceans of blood that have been spilled in our name. And we need to understand, how is this possible at the same time? And I would think maybe it is worthwhile to do some research on the fact that we continue to push aside that we have these blatant, racist, sexist, superiorist ways of thinking in the foundational documents of our philosophical self-understanding. So what I'm trying to say is, if Kant was indeed somebody who looked down upon people of so-called other races, and that has had influence on the way he developed his further understanding of the human being, and thus his further understanding of what a human being ought to do, ought not to do, or how human reason works, or how his whole political philosophy is set up. Then we have to figure out if the superiorist thinking has contaminated the other philosophies, and if these other philosophical bits have been constructed, on the one hand, blatantly disregarding the experience and world understanding of a large amount of human beings, and if this philosophy, on the other hand, has been contaminated by not only ignoring people, but by willingly ignoring these people because for some reason they are not, their experiences and their thoughts are not valid to be taken into account, and that has influenced the political understanding of, for example, freedom or democracy, then it would not be a surprise if this heritage would still have a practical effect today. And
so let's talk about a bit about this concept of I think you call it superiorization.
Yeah.
Could you explain what that is, and then maybe if you can explain maybe in detail how it still impacts the world around us today?
Yeah. Superiorism is a concept that I try to develop to find sort of an umbrella term that covers all the concepts where people put themselves above other people, or where human beings put themselves about other things or about other non-human animals and so on. So we have all these concepts of racism and sexism or speciesism or ableism and so on. And the problem very often is that for example, in Kant, he still puts himself over another human being. And strangely enough, this putting yourself over another human being usually goes together within the Western paradigm as being allowed to rule that other human being or that other entity. I'm sorry, guys. I'm really struggling with.
Don't worry about it.
No, to be very honest. So the problem here, to give you a little background why I'm showing so much. Yesterday, I gave a lecture on superiorism,
Okay.
and it went pretty well. But it brought me to a new level of reflection where I'm now doubting much more than last week my concept of superiorism. So on the one hand, it's a very trivial concept because it tries to point out that there are human beings who by choice, by their very will, put into existence a hierarchical difference between themselves and other people. And they do that based on different real or alleged facts that they find in their lives, which is, for example, that somebody is different in one or the other way. And these differences can be differences of money or of age or of whatever that actually is, of race. And usually when people find these differences and they understand themselves as the one and the other as the other, there's a strange normativization of this relationship. So the one is not only the one, and the other is not only the other, the one is the better one, and the other is the worst one. And this relationship, this normative inferiorization, this contempt that we see there, can be a contempt that is based on different, allegedly observed criteria. And then what happens then is that the person who identifies themselves as the one superiorizes themselves in comparison with the alleged inferior. And I think that is a structure that is very prominent in a lot of societal phenomena. And I think that as much as it is important to differentiate between different forms of superiorism, I think it is very important that we understand that there's an overall identical element in all these structures of subjugation or of oppression or of putting people down. And I think this is important in a broader societal scale, because I'm very sure that if we allow certain forms of contempt, certain forms of superiorism within society, we will not get rid of other forms of contempt or superiorism that are also prevalent in a certain society. That we need to understand that between all these, that amongst all these ways to inferiorize people, there's a structurally identical core. It is something that we do, and I think if we do not address, or if we do not sort of concentrate our forces of overcoming this on this structural core, we will continue to have a problem. And this is why I think that, for example, an anti-racist movement has also at the same time to be anti-sexist. And from my understanding, it would be a movement that at the same time would also be anti-species. And what we have experienced so far in the world is, for example, for some reason, men were able to subjugate women. And of course, I lack the ability to understand why this is something that humans seem to do and why there's an urge to do that. But what we do see is that there's also an urge to not do that. But my point is, I do not like if somebody addresses this and says that's just the nature of the human being, that's what we do. From my point of view, at some point, it was made a choice, and that choice perpetuated and became a tradition. But if we could choose to do this, we can choose to do otherwise. There's no inherent natural necessity that makes us look down on other human beings.
So before we ask how can we do that, before we ask how can we uproot superiorism? So you said that yesterday you had a lecture on superiorism, and then after the lecture you entered the stage of reflection, and some thoughts occurred that maybe you could tweak the original concept. So I just wanted to give you a chance to talk a bit about that, and give us a rare opportunity to see the mind of a philosopher at work.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Yesterday I was giving a lecture on superiorism, and even though I'm still very drawn to that concept, there are, of course, still a lot of problems. And the major problem I think I ran into is that if you talk about superiorism, it's still making use of a sort of a binary understanding of the world. And usually, if somebody points that out, I comment on that by saying that there are two problems. The one problem is I for the philosophical community working on that, we still lack, let me say, a post-colonial vocabulary that lets us avoid these kinds of grouping the world, of making different groups amongst human beings or amongst the living entities that we're surrounded by. So even though I think that's a good reason, it's still, of course, it's not really a fruitful continuation of the discussion because it says it's something that I cannot do and that's just the way it is. And the other problem that I run into is what I try to do when I talk about superiorism is, to sort of sneak into the minds of those who superiorize. And of course, if I do that, I probably, to a degree that I'm not self-aware of, I'm not aware of all these traditions that also influence my mind without me being able to acknowledge it. I think this is only possible to be pointed out by other philosophers or by other colleagues or by other people with whom I talk about these things. And I realized that as much as I want to overcome the ground, the very ground that I'm standing on, I still stand on it. And I just realized that this little bit of earth on which my feet rests is just the piece of earth that I will not be able to see while I stand on it. It really came to, it was very obvious to me when I tried to give an answer to the question, how can you talk about, or how can you still apply this binary thinking? And of course, I try to sneak into the mind of those who binarily think. But at the same time, I of course do that too, because I differentiate myself from those who think like that and still think it's good. But I try to not do that in a way that I could.
If I can interject here, because
yeah, sure.
I mean, I understand the concern of adopting a binary framework, conceptual framework, and how we differentiate the world. But it seems to me that the framework, the binary framework that you are trying to implement or are adopting, does not necessitate the inferiorization of the other. So it's a purely
yeah, I'm very happy that you say that.
So if I can expand it a bit, it seems to me that you're not saying that the person who implements superiorism in their lives is worth less. It seems to me that that's not what you're saying. What you're saying is that we need to talk to this person, or we need to find a way to move past this, because again, it's very simple and very vague of me to say this person, because it's not just one person. It's a very implicit thing that I myself is part of this tradition where we comprehend the world in a binary way. But again, you're not saying that we're inherently inferior for believing in superiorism. So a racist is not a less of a human being for being racist.
Yeah, I think what is important here is to acknowledge, and that is, of course, something that troubles me, and I think it troubles a lot of people working in this area, is that we are all guilty, if one may say so, of superiorism. We all do that. And usually we all do that before even understanding that we have done that. When we meet a person, we usually very quickly realize if we are drawn to that person or not drawn to that person. And I don't think there's a lot that we can do about it other than openly acknowledge that and try to still approach that person as a person or an entity, a living entity, because I really try to theorize about this, not excluding non-human animals, that we approach that entity with a certain appreciation of that particular being's being. But what I try to develop, it's of course not a final system. It's more the heuristic. It's the ladder that has its flaws that we at some point probably will have to throw away. And maybe I will be too much in love with that ladder, and maybe I will not be able to throw it away. But maybe that thing still gave pointers to those who at some point will no longer need that. And of course, I try to develop a practical or ethical understanding of interactions that does not necessarily require to superiorize each other. So we have to find a way to interact with each other by pointing out the differences. Because if there's one thing that is really not very helpful, is if we continue to pretend that everybody is like one another and that we are the same. I think we need to point out that there are differences, and that there are differences that we are not able to overcome. It is a foundational difference in your existential self-determination if you think that Jesus is a prophet or that Jesus is the Messiah. That will make a difference, and that difference cannot be negotiated with. So, but how do we make it possible that we still are able to talk to each other? And the one way I think it's not possible by claiming that we're actually talking about the same thing, because we're not actually talking about the same thing. I think we're talking about something that on the existential level is so different that it will lead to different forms, different ways of life. And these different ways of life will conflict at some point with one another. And what I think is impossible to reach is what I like to call an understanding of the material identity of what we existentially find important. By material identity, I mean a unity about the fact, for example, if Jesus is a Messiah or if Jesus is a prophet. We will not be able to think the one is right and the other is right. We will, for our very own lives, adopt one of these opinions, or of course, a completely different one. And I think in this case, what we need to do is, because I said it is important to appreciate the differences, is to step back a little bit and understand that this is a matter of the heart, and the matter of the heart determines what I like to call our existentiality, and the way that we establish existential facts within our lives that will then determine the person who we think we should be. But if we step back a little bit, we can indeed find a way of identity, which I think can be addressed as formal identity. So we cannot find unification with regards to the material difference that we find in the matters of our heart. But if we step back, we find a formal identity that this matter of the heart has a certain valid importance for a very specific person. And if I do not respect you for the fact that you think that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, I will still be able to understand that this is the matter of your heart, and that you use this particular matter of the heart, for example, adopting the Christian way of life. And then I can compare this sort of the formal or functional element. I can compare this with the functional or formal element in my life, and I will be able to tolerate you in a positive, not just in a disregarding way, but in a positive way of you having been able to determine your life in a different way. And I can respect that you have developed a particular way of life based on that matter of the heart that is different from my matter of the heart. But what is identical is that it is a matter of hearts. So what I've tried to do is to develop something that is very, very raw and has not been developed very far. What I try to develop is something that I like to call elative ethics, or an elative ethics of the matters of the heart. And this tries to have its starting point from the weird and simply not justifiable fact that it is philosophically not possible to prove that one person is better than another person, that a black person is of less value than a white person. I think whenever we have done that, we are philosophically not able to produce an argument that cannot be reasoned with. So what I do not deny is that there's differences, but what I do deny is that these differences are necessary to be interpreted in a normative way. Just because two things are different, that does not mean that one of these things is better than the other. Just because two things are different, that does not mean that this has normative consequences. So what we try to point out with elative ethics is that two very different things can be the greatest things without necessarily being on a matrix where we can compare these two things with each other. And of course you can say, but will that not lead to millions of practical problems? I'm pretty sure it will, but we have to start at some point where we can appreciate one another without this strange conviction of actually being the same or of actually being different, but only one of us is right. I think what we need to do is, in the first place, is to simply acknowledge differences and to try to unlearn that differences implies normative difference. Differences imply differences, and that's it.
So Bjoern, how can the field of philosophy begin to dissuperiorize?
Yes, of course, that's a very difficult question, but I think there's a couple of things that we need to do definitely. And one of these things is to understand that superiorism is not something that we have been forced to do. It is not an existential necessity that the human being has to apply. I think it is done by choice. I think it is done by choice for a long time, so much that we have had reason to believe that it is our nature. But I think we have to address this and understand that this is not our nature. It is not our nature to look down. I'm speaking from the position of the white heterosexual male, to look down on women or on homosexual or on people who are poor. This is not in our nature, and we can indeed change that. So the first thing that we need to do is this sort of acknowledging the, as I like to say, the existentiality of superiorism and unacknowledge the facticity of it. The second thing would be to overcome the ongoing colonial violence. And one part, I've specified this for academic philosophy, is to overcome the colonial violence, is to give up the understanding that philosophy is necessarily Western philosophy. It is a little bit similar to what feminist philosophers have experienced. There's a certain acknowledgement that feminist philosophy exists, but it's rather strange to think that there's philosophy and one subgroup of philosophy is feminist philosophy. I never heard of andrist philosophy. That specific feminist philosophy was only necessary because females have been excluded from philosophy. And that's pretty much the same thing as we have in the colonial discourse. And this is a fascinating thing because feminist philosophy is sort of the anti-Western paradigm within the West. And it's structurally very close to a lot of the elements that we find at the decolonial course. So if we want to desuperiorize philosophy academically, we have to open philosophy to all the philosophers, regardless of where they come from. And that, of course, will have a lot of consequences on what
if I can interject,
yeah.
just to put
yeah.
a sort of objection to that. Presumably, in a charitable understanding of the differentiation between the general term of philosophy and the specific term feminist philosophy, is that feminist philosophy talks about the female experience, and general philosophy is subdivided into other groups that talk about causality, talk about political philosophy, and
epistemology, metaphysics.
Epistemology. However, I understand that the problem you're leading towards is that at the moment, the number of female philosophers working in epistemology, working in metaphysics, is substantially lower to the number of male philosophers. So I'm not sure that the issue, what I wanted originally to contend was that I'm not sure that the issue is one of a categorization, but rather is one of representation of the different experiences in philosophy.
Yes, I do agree. But I think that categorization is responsible for the representation. So what I think is that if we talk about philosophy, how is it possible that female philosophers had to fight their male philosopher colleagues to make their voice heard? The problem is that if we do philosophy, we can focus on certain areas because they are of special interest. But what is usually happening is when we talk about philosophy as it is, we usually talk about a very specific canon that excludes a lot of voices. This differentiation is not just the acknowledgement of a difference. It is the acknowledgement of a hierarchical difference, of a normatively hierarchical difference. The disregard of female philosophers is not a disregard because there are no female philosophers. There are indeed many female philosophers, way less than there probably would have been if female voices would have been regarded in an appropriate way. But there are a lot of female philosophers, but we continue to choose in our curricula and in academic settings to not read them. And it is not because these texts do not exist. They are regarded as of less importance, as non-canonical, or whatever it is. So what I think we need to do with regards to desuperiorization of the canon is probably to question if there should be a philosophical canon at all, and maybe approach philosophy more in the sense of trying to learn to philosophize. And trying to learn to philosophize is different from trying to learn about the most important philosophers. Who are the most important philosophers? Usually the philosophers who have had the most impact. But if you look in today's world, and we have blatant, obvious, evident problems of massive racism and sexism and ableism and classism, maybe we need to question the heritage of these philosophers, because these philosophers, or many of them, opposed more or less explicitly some of these issues. These issues are still here. And maybe we have to ask our question, if there's any continuity, if there's any exchange between what philosophers thought and continue to think and the societal reality, we have to say we probably should question our heritage and maybe critically reevaluate it and figure out, why do we still have these problems when more than 200 years ago we figured out that all human beings are created equally?
Perhaps I can just sort of close out with a sort of nice, easy question. Do you have any, book recommendations? Would you like to plug any of your work, any of your own?
Of course, I would feel very silly to recommend any of my own work. What I would, but maybe the thing that I said, that how much my philosophy has been shaped by reading. Yeah, how to say that, outside of my comfort, outside of my training zone. That's certainly the one thing that I would really recommend. There are different people. Well, talk to them. Read a different newspaper than you usually read. Read a book which title makes you feel a bit uncomfortable. And I think it should be fairly easy to get in touch, be it personally or through any sort of media, to learn something that you do not know, and to realize there are different ways of looking at the world. And how should you learn about that other than being in what is called in intercultural studies in a polylogue, in being in exchange with a lot of different people? And even if you feel uncomfortable in doing that and choose not to do that, well, the only thing that you would probably have to do then is not feel entitled to comment on everything and all in the world, and to not feel entitled to say that this has to be like this and that has to be like that. And if you feel uncomfortable getting in exchange with a person that is different from you, maybe you should think about the fact, what does that say about you? And in what way does that have an effect on your overall interaction with human beings or with other living beings?
Bjoern, thank you very much for speaking with us. And hopefully you'll come onto the podcast another time.
I will. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. I'd be honored. Yeah, guys, thank you very much for having me. It was very, very exciting and very challenging for me to talk about these issues. And I thank you very much for giving the opportunity to me to speak to you and thus make these issues, which I find very important, maybe a little more known.
Thank you for being here with us. Thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.